What's happening, security gang? LayerX was kind enough to invite me over to talk about security identity and enterprise identity and just general and understanding and mitigating the risks of shadow identity. So welcome to today's webinar. Eyal, Artsy and I, Arazi and I, sorry, my favorite Israeli artist is Shlomo Artsy. I'm sorry, it's came off my tongue. All right. So Eyal, Arazi, and I have done plenty of webinars together talking about understanding and mitigating the risks of shadow identity here. Our friends over at LayerX. Eyal, this is a very interesting webinar and a very interesting topic. What do you make out of it?
So first of all, thanks, James, for joining us. And indeed, as you say, identity is top of mind for a lot of organizations today. And in many corners, it's actually being called kind of the new perimeter. And if that is the new perimeter, that means then securing that border is also the key to protecting your organization as a whole. So we actually did a report recently by LayerX using the data, real life data we have from our customers, where we actually saw a lot of the challenges that organizations are dealing with. And that helped us identify what organizations should be concerned about and where they should be putting their efforts.
Perfect. Yeah, it's this topic is near and dear to my heart as a practitioner because I've been saying for ages, you've got to identify every single threat vector to identity, and then you've got to build resilience around those threat vectors. Otherwise, you're playing a zero-sum game.
So moving into today's agenda, we'd like to present a few key findings from the report itself. The report is full of data. We don't want this to be a big data dump full of numbers, but we do want to highlight a few key facts and stats for both for you, James, and also for security practitioners everywhere that they should be aware of. Based on that, we'd like to offer a few actionable techniques that organizations can implement on what they can do to further secure their corporate identities. I'd like to do a very quick section on how LayerX can help, and of course, open it up for Q&A. Speaking of which, we want your questions. We want this to be a conversation as much as possible. There will be a dedicated Q&A section at the end. But that being said, there's a Q&A box that you can use throughout. James will be monitoring it, and we'd love for you to put in your questions as we go along. Ask us to elaborate, challenge us, push back. We'd like to hear from you as much as possible. So before we move into the report as a whole, just a few words on the report. As I said, LayerX recently just put out its 2024 Identity Security Report. This is based on our real-life data from our user base, which are deployed in organizations ranging from mid-sized enterprises all the way to large-scale global enterprises with hundreds of thousands of users. And this report looks at multiple aspects of identity security, both internal, external, governance, browser extension security, and more. It's laden both with key findings and recommendations for what you can do. And I definitely encourage the audience to have a look and read for yourself, and not just look at what we're at the kind of the tip of the iceberg that we'll be talking about today. So that being said, let's move over to presenting a few key findings from the 2024 LayerX Identity Security Report. So if there's one thing that I would like everyone, who's watching this to remember, if there's just one thing that you forget everything else we talk about, is that the bottom line of your risk comes down to about 2% of users in your organization. Now, this is not a number that we're just making up, out of thin air, but rather it is kind of the sum and the cross-section of several risk categories. First of all, it's users that don't use SSO on corporate accounts. Next, it's users who have weak passwords. And by weak, we actually mean medium strength or below, because even medium strength passwords today are easily crackable by modern hardware and software. And finally, it's users, corporate users, mind you, that appeared and have been exposed in data breaches containing passwords. So not just any data breach or web scraping out there in general, but breaches where passwords have been exposed, either in plain text or hashes. And when you do the cross-section of all of those, that comes out on average, based on our research, to about 1.8% of corporate users. And again, if you forget everything else we talk about, these are the critical risk users that you need to focus on and make sure that those are locked down and and that you mitigate the risk in each of these vectors, because that's where your biggest threat lies. So let me dive briefly onto each of these circles, plus on a few other key stats. So first of all, with regards to the perimeter, one of the key questions that emerged from the identity report that we just put out is how can you protect, if the perimeter is the new identity, how can you protect that which you don't know about? And this is really important because according to our findings, significant proportions of corporate identities are actually blind to organizational IT and security teams, or rather, IT and security teams are blind to the usage of those accounts. According to our findings, about over two-thirds of corporate login events are done not using SSO. Now, which means they're using just a password. Now, you might say, well, they're still protected by a password, and that password may or may not be strong. But the point is that the organization is blind to them, because when you use SSO, it's also associated with your IDP, which means that your IDP has visibility to the usage of that identity, of that account. The organization knows that it's being used. The organization knows where it's being used, and it's subject to password governance policies. When you're not using SSO, all of that flies out of the window. The organization doesn't know about that usage. IDP is blind to it, and the password may or may not be effective, which may or may not expose you in turn. So that's just on corporate identities. But apart from that, a significant portion of SaaS application logins are done using personal accounts. Now, sometimes that usage might be completely valid. For example, I'm logging to my personal Gmail account using an organizational computer. But sometimes that may not be valid usage. For example, I'm logging into my personal OneDrive account, and I'm using it to store corporate data on it. And again, the organization is completely blind to all of that usage. And when
It's
you,
it's
again, do a
it's a bigger
cross-section of all of these,
challenge.
yeah, please go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah, that's a bigger challenge. I'll tell you why. When you think of it, if we broke this down by departments, I guarantee you, the vast majority of people using their personal like Gmail address to access specific data exist on the DevOps and application side of the house, simply because every single DevOps developer I know on the planet's got a corporate GitHub and a personal GitHub, right? Where they're working on different projects. And so
James,
they're
that's a great question. That's a great research question for next year as well. I'll definitely keep that in mind. But you make a great point because, again, we don't have the data on it, but intuitively it, does make sense that, it's not going to be necessarily the finance people that, it may be, but probably the more tech savvy users are going to have more personal accounts, more, personal GitHub, their personal OneDrive account, maybe, other things as well. And when you put a bottom line under all of this, this means that organizations are blind to about 80% of login events, of SaaS login events taking place within their network. And that is, a huge, percentage. And effectively, organizations are blind to most shadow identity usage. Now, the challenges, however, don't stop, just with the identities, because you said, you have a password, password's protecting it, right? Well, not necessarily so, because one of the things that really surprised us, by the way, in our research was that corporate account passwords were actually just as bad as personal ones. And initially, we were expecting that, we're going to have personal accounts, with crappy passwords, and we're going to have corporate account, really good passwords. And what we found was that they were, in terms of usage, they were about the same. So on average, about 56% of all accounts, personal and corporate accounts, had passwords that were medium strength or below. For corporate accounts, it was 54% that had medium strength or below. And personal accounts, it had 58% that were medium strength or below. So even though corporate accounts did have a bit of an edge, it was fairly close. And when you actually look down, when you look at the breakdown of how it looks between different categories of strong, very strong, medium, and so on, pretty much it looks almost about the same. 11% of corporate accounts were very weak. 11% of personal accounts had very weak passwords. 19% of corporate accounts had medium strength passwords. 19% of personal accounts had medium strength passwords. So, it was remarkably similar just in terms of distribution, which leads us to see that there's really no difference between them. Now, for the purposes of our assessment, we said that anything that is, not strong is a bad password, because when you look at, today's processors, today's servers, the software that they use, even a medium strength password can be cracked in 30 minutes or less. So even if you're exposed in a data breach as a hash, that's really no protection in our view. So if you're relying on passwords, typically it's bad. Moreover, finishing that thread we started on, we saw that users who appeared in breaches in data breaches in which passwords were exposed were more risky than other types of users. So we used a sample set of data of users from our database, and we checked how many of them have been exposed in public facing data breaches, and we saw that about 20% of corporate users using their corporate email address were exposed in a public data breach. But not all breaches are created the same. Sometimes, it can be just a scraping of, a public database, but, there are no passwords involved. So, your information, is out there, but, not your accounts. So when we looked specifically at breaches involving passwords, we saw that about 9.3%, or just under 10% of corporate users were exposed in such a breach. And when we looked at, how many data breach events were associated with each type of user, we saw that users who appeared in data breaches containing passwords appeared in 61% more data breaches than users who did not appear in breaches containing passwords. So it was 9.5 versus 5.9 data breach events. Now, the data doesn't explain why this is so, but it just goes to show that users who have had their passwords exposed in the past are simply, that much more risky to deal with, and that much, require close attention to make sure that, they're fully locked down in the future. The one last point of data that I want to talk about to make sure we're not overwhelming the audience here is the issue of browser extensions, because this is something that we found as kind of an unknown threat that a lot of organizations are overlooking. So what we found is that over 2/3 of browser extensions installed in organizational networks had high or critical risk permissions. And those permissions typically were related to identity. So that, for example, your session data, your cookies, identity data, even to input capture in web session data that sees plain text passwords being typed. So those have they can have that type of access. So 2/3 of extensions had higher critical risk permissions. And over 50% of users had installed a browser extension that had such permissions. And we look specifically, when we look, for example, specifically at session cookies, we found that over 5% of users, so 1 out of 20 users, organizational users, had a browser extension that could access their cookie. And think about it, if you're using a malicious, or if you have a malicious browser extension deployed on your computer, and someone steals that cookie, they can effectively use it as a session token and gain, access to the sites and networks that you have access to. So those are the key data points that we found that we felt were most pertinent to organizations. And again, when you combine all of those data points together, you find that there are about 2% of users that are your biggest risk, and those are the ones that you need to worry about. So moving on ahead, we wanted to make sure that this session is not just a data dump for, here's a bunch of interesting data, but rather, what are some key takeaways that you can take from it and hopefully apply within your own organization. So we want to give a few actionable steps to help organizations reduce their identity risks and threats. So the first action item is to discover all identities. Now, admittedly, that is easier said than done, but it is really the fundamental and foundational piece to everything else, because it answers the basic question of what identities are being used within the organizational perimeter on my SaaS apps and so on. Where are these identities being consumed? Whether they're web pages, SaaS apps, Gen AI tools, sanctioned applications, non-sanctioned applications, and so on. And finally, mapping all of those identities to the users who are using them. And sometimes it might be a one-to-one mapping. Sometimes you might have shared accounts being used across multiple users. So you need to make sure that you map all of those out to have a full audit of all identities in your organization, because that is really, your security perimeter. The next step is to really to verify your identity hygiene by preventing account sharing and password reuse, because that's a really easy way of cross-contaminating accounts and identities. Because, going back to what we talked earlier, if you have an account which is exposed in a data breach and they're not using SSO and they're using a weak password, and that same account or same password is being shared across multiple users, or that password is being reused across multiple accounts, then that opens you up to exposure on many fronts. So you want to make sure that you identify all the shared accounts in the organization and who's using them, and you want to make sure that you're identifying reused passwords, especially between cross-sharing between corporate and non-corporate accounts, and make sure that you identify and lock those down and prevent them. The next item is to enforce SSO. And that, again, follows the conversation of what we've been talking so far about, passwords and the weakness of passwords, especially in light of modern password cracking hardware and software. A really good way of, going beyond that is to use SSO and to also factor in, use multi-factor authentication and similar methods. And that makes sure that there are multiple layers of protection on your account, and that all of your account usage goes through your IDP. So at bare minimum, there's visibility to the organization. So that helps you identify all non-SSO users. And when possible, mandate that SSO be used everywhere. And if you can't, or it's not, see how you can restrict user activity on applications that don't use SSO. Kind of following in that same train of thought, restrict non-corporate SaaS usage. So a lot of the SaaS applications that we use nowadays in organizational settings will typically support multiple types of accounts, and users will have multiple accounts on them. James, you mentioned developers having a corporate GitHub and a personal GitHub. In my organization, we use Google Drive, so I have my own personal Gmail account with my Google Drive, and I have my corporate Google Drive account. I have you can have a personal Microsoft OneDrive account. When you go on ChatGPT, you can use you log in. You can use either your personal or your corporate account. So a good way to limit identity risk is also to restrict as much as possible on organizational endpoints and within organizational settings on non-corporate SaaS usage. So again, mapping it all out, including, shadow SaaS and shadow AI usage. Easier said than done, but required nonetheless. Enforcing SSO where possible, and restricting activity on personal accounts, for example, that you can't share maybe files, you can't upload files containing sensitive data to your personal Google Drive or GitHub account. And the final piece is to, going back to the discussion on browser extensions, is to enumerate browser extensions and browser extension permissions within the organization. So, again, easier said than done, but you want to map out all browser extensions in the organization. You want to classify each of those browser extensions, what is being used for, is it Gen AI enabled, and so on. And you want to classify the permissions granted to that extension and assign it a risk score of, is this something that, has very extensive access to identity data, for example, password stores, cookies, identities, and so on, or whether, it's benign. And you want to enforce, adaptive security policies that factor in, classification and risk. So, looking at all of these are actionable steps that we encourage organizations to start taking today to reduce and limit their exposure on identity risks. So let me move into a brief explanation on how LayerX can help. So we talked a lot in this presentation on SaaS usage, SaaS applications, and identities, especially on SaaS applications, Gen AI, and web activity. So LayerX is a browser security platform, which is deployed as a browser extension, which means that we can be deployed within organizations on all browsers, on all endpoints, whether managed or unmanaged devices, and be deployed seamlessly with no disruption to the existing user flows or to the user experience. And by being deployed directly in the browser, that effectively allows us visibility and control and enforcement pretty much over everything that organizational users do within the browser. So it allows us to see, which identities and accounts they're using, which SaaS apps they're browsing to, how are they logging into them or authenticating, are they using passwords or SSO, what passwords they're using, are they strong passwords, are they being reused on other accounts as well. And pretty much allows us full visibility into everything happening within the browser and across SaaS applications, and through that to identify and to limit identity risks. LayerX is a browser security solution, not in the sense that we protect the browser. We do that as well, but that's not what we're here for. But rather because the browser has become kind of the nerve center of the modern organization, and most work activity is nowadays done through the browser, that allows us to help organizations to deal with a very wide array of use cases, including web and SaaS DLP, shadow SaaS and SaaS security, browser extension protection, secure browsing, Gen AI security, remote access to SaaS applications, and of course, identity protection, and also function as an alternative to a very wide set of tools, for example, enterprise browsers, legacy remote browser RBI solutions, SSE, or VDI. And of course, because identities are crucial to so many of these use cases and so many of these legacy tools, that effectively, allows us to, solve a lot of these challenges and also apply identity protection and security, across all of these different attack vectors. So I'd like to jump to a very brief demo to just highlight a few key capabilities. I'll stop my share for just a moment while I pop up my screen. Give me just one sec. So let me go back into sharing. So here we're looking at the LayerX console. I just want to show a few brief highlights of our capabilities, and then we'll move to the Q&A section. So first of all, one of the key items here is we talked about is discovery. So LayerX, again, because we're deployed as a browser solution, has full visibility to everything happening within the browser. So that includes all users, all apps, all the SaaS applications that, and it's taking a little bit of time to load up here, all of the accounts that we have, extensions, browsers, and of course, devices, and a bit slow today, but we can see all of these. So for example, when I'm looking at users, I can see all of the users, their username, which identities they're using, which devices they're being deployed on, are they managed or unmanaged, what accounts they're using, whether they're corporate or personal accounts, what SaaS applications they're using, and so on and so forth. And of course, as we said, that helps out to map the perimeter of the identity perimeter of the organization. And of course, same goes to applications and accounts. Clicking on an application, I can see exactly who's using that, who's using it, the login method, is it SSO, is it password, and so on. And when I'm looking at accounts, I can see things like, again, see which account is being used on which SaaS application, the login type, is it using, for example, Okta or SSO with Google, with it a password, an assessment of the password strength, is it being shared across multiple users, is it a corporate or non-corporate account, information on OAuth scopes, and so on, which again help to map the identity perimeter of the organization. And I'll just show briefly on security policies. So we can have very granular, and we can define very granular security policies where either event-based or based on a specific website. So let's do, for example, when I go to I choose an event-based security policy. So I can choose, for example, on login, when the user, is it a corporate identity or non-corporate identity? Or for example, if the login, is it coming from a certain domain? Or if I can choose based on, OAuth scopes and things like that. So it allows very granular security policies, which can be defined based on, triggers associated with either with identity security or with threats to identity protection. So give me just one second. I'll pop back into the presentation. So that was that. So just for the demo, I just wanted to very briefly give a taste of what we can accomplish on our system. And just to make sure that we're respectful of everyone's time and see we're coming up on the time, let's move into the Q&A section. So James, I saw as we were talking that there were a number of questions that were being input into the Q&A box, and you were monitoring them.
Yeah, so let's take a few of these. I mean, primarily, a recurring theme here has been the kind of the idea of how do you get control of corporate identities in that type of environment.
So that's a really good question, and there are no easy solutions for it. But however, there are a few kind of fundamentals that you need to observe. First of all is discovery. You can't deal with a problem unless you know about it. So unless you're using a tool like LayerX, you're not going to know about these non-SSO or non-corporate identities because they're not going through your IDP, so you don't have visibility to them. So for example, as I just demonstrated, when you have a tool like LayerX, which is deployed directly in the browser, you can see all of them, and you can see all of that usage, track, who's using it, who's using which accounts, and to which SaaS applications. So that is, one factor. That's kind of the foundation layer. The second layer on top of that is governance, is to look at, once you have established, knowledge of, those accounts or those identities, are they using, SSO or not? Are they using, weak or strong passwords? Are they sharing those accounts across multiple users? Are they reusing those passwords? What are their OAuth scope permissions, things like that. And through that, you go beyond just discovery into actual, identification of weak points. And then kind of the layer on top of that is enforcement, is based on those triggers, on those events, to apply active enforcement. So for example, if you are using a personal account on an organizational SaaS, or on a SaaS app that is used for organizational purposes, for example, GitHub, and you're using your corporate endpoint computer. So for example, force usage of SSO, or block personal accounts, or block upload of files containing sensitive data. And again, you need to have control there of the authentication method, the control over file upload, the ability to scan each file and identify sensitive corporate data, and so on. And say, if that's the condition, I'm going to block it. Or for example, if this is a high-risk phishing website, make it read-only. Make sure that users don't input accidentally any identity information. And that is exactly where LayerX can come in by sitting directly in the browser, monitoring every single web interaction, collecting that data, and then using that data to enforce active, adaptive controls.
Another question, Al, that came up was around, the slide with the password strength, right? Where we looked and we saw kind of, 54, 58% of passwords were not strong, and so forth. Well, a lot of that, and some of the feedback here throughout the webinar was, that's, kind of security can set the policy, but IT's got to enforce it. How do you balance the two? What's kind of some stuff you've seen with customers about balancing, password strength?
So I think everyone hates passwords because, passwords ultimately are difficult. If you make them, too long and too strenuous and too secure, no one's going to use them because, it's too much of a pain in the butt. But if you don't make them, strong enough, then it's a weakness. And it's a weakness that can and will be exploited. So it's a really good question of how do you balance those two. As we see it, there are two or three kind of, again, foundational steps that you need to take. First of all is enforcing SSO, which allows you also to enforce multi-factor authentication for corporate accounts. So what that means is that even if your password strength is medium, or even weak, let's take it to the extreme. If you have additional authentication, for example, MFA through your mobile app, or text messages, whatever, that's an additional layer of control, an additional layer of protection. But the foundational requirement is that you enforce the usage of SSO. So enforcing SSO is crucial here. The second step is how you deal with non-corporate accounts. And we live in a hybrid world. People are using their computers, their work computers, for both work and non-work activities. There's no way to control it. It's very difficult to say, I'm just going to do work. But for example, you can limit the functionality, for example, of non-work accounts. Either limit them completely and say, yes, if you want to do personal stuff, use a different computer, use a different browser. Or you can apply data level protections. For example, I'm going to scan the files that you upload to Google Drive, but I'm going to make sure that they don't contain sensitive corporate data. So I'm going to allow you to do the function, but I'm going to restrict personal data usage. So, kind of the enforcement is the second piece. And the third piece is what we referred to earlier as hygiene, as identity hygiene of, making sure that, you're using not just strong passwords, but also, password, you limit password reuse, you limit account sharing, you limit, risky permissions, for example, in OAuth scopes or through browser extensions. And again, there's no foolproof 100%, lockdown that you can do, but you are constantly limiting and, limiting your exposure and eliminating threats.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I'll add to what you just said, Eyal, to kind of wrap this up in a nice bow as we wrap up today's webinar is this. You hit the nail on the head. You've got to allow the function, but you've got to limit the exposure, right? At the end of the day, security is business operations. As a SSO, every single day, it's not what can I do to block, but what can we do to support the business function while ensuring that we're not introducing new risks to our environment, right? And we're also not frustrating the users. And
It's a
that
really
comes
key
into a
point.
few things, right? That comes into a few things. You've got to be able to use tools that don't interfere with business operations and don't frustrate your users. If your users have to go through 300 hoopties to get something done, you're doing security wrong. You're doing security wrong, and people are going to look for ways to go around you. And then you think you got it all done, only to realize there's a whole subset of ways to go around your controls, because guess what? For every control, there's a decontrol. And that's just that's just the truth of it. So as security people, we have to be very conscious of that. And what the survey really tells me as a practitioner is the following. We're still not accurately reflecting our security practices to business operations. We're failing to match security to how business is supposed to operate, and we're failing to utilize proper tools to do that. And I think there's going to be a significant need over the next, several months and years that more and more security practitioners go through the process maps of how business functions take place, order to delivery, the whole nine, right? Uh, Ideation to prod. You've got to go through that whole process, and you've got to identify in those areas of the processes where your greatest risks exist. Once you identify those risks, then you look for interactive and proactive ways to approach that risk rather than shutting it down. And once you do that once or twice and you reduce the risk, you become a fan in the company. And security is no longer the people of no or the people that are coming in to shut you down. They're rather coming in to help you do what you do best securely. That's the goal of every practitioner. And that's my main takeaway from the report.
So I think that's a really excellent point there, James, in terms, what you said about business enablement and also limiting your risks. And going back to where we started, that's why we really highlighted the issue of those 2% or 1.8% of users that are kind of the biggest risk of non-SSO users, weak passwords, and previously exposed in data breaches, because that's a really good place to start and then work backwards and make sure that you're focusing first on your most high risk, on the smallest section possible, on the small segment possible of the most high risk users, and then working backwards to users who are less at risk, and therefore, you can cause less interruption to their daily work. But that, those are a few really great points that you made, and you also, raised, as we went along, a few great questions for next year's survey. So I want to thank everyone, for their attendance today. So first of all, if you were interested in what we presented, both in the data and in the capabilities that we presented of LayerX, I put here a QR code that leads you to the demo request page on our website. So you can, if you want, you can take out your phones, take a snapshot of that QR code, and that will lead you to the demo page or to the demo request page on LayerX, and we'll be happy to do a personal demo specifically to your needs, whether your use case is identity protection or anything else that we cover. And of course, today we gave just a glimpse of the tip of the iceberg of our capabilities. I see that there's still a number of questions that are unanswered in the forum, in the Q&A box. So we will be getting back to all of those viewers later on to make sure that everyone has their questions addressed. And finally, James, I want to thank you for being here today and co-hosting with me and adding your perspective to this conversation as well. I hope that you found this educational. I hope that the audience
Absolutely.
found this helpful.
Thank you,
And
Eyal. Thank you, LayerX, for the invite and for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for everyone for watching the webinar. And definitely go download the report because it was eye-opening for me when I saw it.
fantastic. So again, thank you everyone for your attendance today. I hope to see you at a future LayerX event, and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye, everyone.